Chapter 2. Aunt Michelle.
"I'm still not sure it's a good idea,"
Scooter was saying, as he and Hoggie were making their way home later that night.
"It seems dangerous." "Sure it is,"
Hoggie responded casually.
"That's what real adventures are like. They're dangerous and unpredictable."
Scooter sighed.
"Do we really need an adventure?" "Of course we do. You don't want to spend the rest of your life regretting things you've never done."
Just then, the friends crossed the street 2 blocks east of the library, and found themselves in front of a grim old house that looked all the grimmer alongside a neat tailor shop and a brightly lit toy store. A couple of years ago, this was a tea-house. It was painted a cheerful yellow colour, and its spotlessly clean windows displayed old-fashioned cupboards filled with real china, pictures of birds on the walls, and a long shiny counter with heaps of fresh muffins and scones on it. The tea-house was called the Grand Canary. The old lady who owned the Grand Canary was very nice. She often gave free samples of her culinary inventions to the neighbourhood children, and, on a cold day, always had a cup of hot chocolate for the homeless guy who sold newspapers on the street corner. But, one day, the old lady retired, and the house passed into the hands of Jonathan Brickenhoff, Brick's father. Almost overnight, everyone's favourite Grand Canary transformed from a gingerbread house to a dark lord's castle. Brickenhoff painted the house grey, installed ugly metal bars on all the windows, and turned the place into a pawn-shop. From that day on, the only people who dared come near the house were those who were poor and absolutely desperate. Hoggie and Aunt Michelle had been to the pawn-shop twice. The first time they pawned the watch that once had belonged to Hoggie's father, and the second time a locket that Aunt Michelle had inherited from her grandma. The watch was gone now, but the locket was still in the shop, imprisoned in a glass box underneath the counter, along with 100 other little mementos the local poor had to relinquish in order to pay rent or buy winter coats for their children. Jonathan Brickenhoff was standing outside the house right now, smoking and impatiently stomping the sidewalk with his made-to-measure boots. He was just as grim and unapproachable as his pawn-shop, and for a moment Hoggie felt sorry for Brick.
"You know,"
Scooter whispered as they walked by,
"my father knows another barrister who is friends with the police officer, and the police think that Brickenhoff sells stolen goods. They just can't prove it."
Hoggie watched Jonathan Brickenhoff yell at a homeless guy for standing too close to his shop. She would not be at all surprised to learn that the pawn-shop owner was a crook. She remembered how, just a few months earlier, she was walking a dog down this very street one early morning. As they passed the pawn-shop, she saw Brickenhoff sneak several large and heavy sacks out of the house, and hastily load them in the boot of his car. She wondered at the time what was in those sacks, and why the shop owner was being so secretive. As the friends continued east, they arrived in Camden. Here, not far from the canal, on a narrow, filthy street named St. Clair's Lane, stood a bleak apartment building that was about 100 years overdue for a fresh coat of paint. In this building, in a tiny flat on the ground floor, lived Hoggie and her aunt. The first impression anyone ever had of Hoggie's and Aunt Michelle's flat was that of a cold and gloomy place. The flat's windows were level with the ground, and facing a dim, narrow alley, so that even on a bright sunny day it was always dark inside. But as soon as the lights in the flat were on, one was captivated by its striking individuality. Every inch of the flat's walls and ceilings was covered in pictures. The kitchen was a deep shade of blue, with hundreds of tiny white jellyfish floating gracefully towards the ceiling. Hoggie's room had an enchanted forest, Aunt Michelle's room a panoramic view of the Versailles Gardens, and the flat's front door bore the image of a creeping white rose. When Scooter visited Hoggie's and Aunt Michelle's for the first time, he thought that they had accidentally wandered into an art museum.
"This is incredible,"
he said, staring at the ceiling in Hoggie's room, across which a flock of griffins was flying.
"These are all Aunt Michelle's paintings,"
Hoggie explained. For the longest time, Hoggie had been reluctant to invite Scooter to her place. By then, she had been to her friend's spacious apartment on the top floor of a stunning building in London's fashionable Primrose Hill, in which everything from the marble kitchen counters and polished hardwood floors to the bathroom the size of Hoggie's and Aunt Michelle's rooms combined, was new, flawless, and expensive. Hoggie had been worrying that once Scooter had seen hers and Aunt Michelle's humble home, he would not want to be friends with her any more. But she had worried in vain.
"Yours and your aunt's flat is the coolest place I've ever seen," Scooter declared. "You're just saying this to be nice, aren't you?"
"No, I mean it." Hoggie was astounded.
"But your apartment building is so much nicer than ours. It has an elevator and a lobby. It even has a doorman. Our building has rats and faulty electric wiring, and it smells of cat pee."
"So what? Your place has personality." Another thing that Scooter liked about Hoggie's flat was that she was allowed to have dogs in it. His building did not allow any cats or dogs, not even very small ones.
"They say I can have a bird," Scooter explained to Hoggie one day, "but a bird is not the same thing as a dog, is it?"
Hoggie's place also allowed the two friends a lot more freedom than Scooter's prim, comfortable building. They could run in the corridors, climb onto the roof, and play music as loudly as they wanted, and none of Hoggie's neighbours would ever complain. And so, whenever the children were not at school or at the library, and whenever the weather was too nasty to be outside, they would stay in Hoggie's and Aunt Michelle's kitchen. The kitchen was where Hoggie and Scooter spent the rest of that very afternoon, planning their search of the library. At 7:15, Hoggie said,
"I have to go and meet Aunt Michelle. She'll be closing the shop soon."
"Why do you need to meet her?"
"It's this pub next door,"
Hoggie explained reluctantly.
"She started stopping there after work on her way home."
"You mean for a beer?"
"If only she stopped at one beer,"
Hoggie muttered uncomfortably.
"At first it was just once or twice a month, but now she's there at least 3 nights a week. Drinking is really bad for Aunt Michelle. It's bad for everyone, but especially her. I suppose she drinks so as not to feel sad, but it just makes things worse. She gets really, really sad. I can hear her cry at night. These walls are like paper. So, I started meeting her outside the shop and walking her home."
Scooter clicked his tongue. "You have to talk to somebody about it."
"To whom? When you are in trouble, you talk to someone older than you, right? And in my family, Aunt Michelle is the oldest person. I can't complain to her about her, can I? And if I tell somebody else, they'll just send me to another foster family, and I'd rather die than go to one of those places."
Hoggie fetched her neighbour's dogs, a pair of rambunctious little pugs named Higgledy and Piggledy, and the 4 of them went to meet Aunt Michelle. Michelle Claus worked at an art gallery. Scooter always imagined galleries as serene places, where beautiful watercolours and elegant statues of marble were exhibited. But in Aunt Michelle's gallery there were no such things. Here were paintings so bizarre, one could not possibly tell what they were depicting.
"I don't get it,"
Hoggie said, as she and Scooter peered through the gallery's windows.
"Why would people pay money for this junk? And a lot of money, too. Look."
She pointed at a painting that resembled a squirrel run over by a car.
"It costs more than our rent for 4 months."
She snorted contemptibly at another painting, which looked like a huge pumpkin that had been dropped from the top of a 20-story building.
"What a bunch of hacks! Aunt Michelle has 10 times their talent, and she has to work as a salesgirl in this horrid place, and the owner is a mean cow." "Michelle, why do you look so sad?"
Hoggie imitated the owner's nasal voice.
"Stop it. It's bad for business."
Just then Aunt Michelle, who was in the shop tidying things up, noticed the children and made them a sign that she would be out in a minute.
"It's a good thing the owner's never here this late,"
Hoggie noted.
"If she saw Higgledy and Piggledy peeing outside the shop, she'd have a fit."
"Why is Aunt Michelle working for this nasty woman?"
"Because full-time jobs are hard to find these days," Hoggie explained, "and Aunt Michelle must have a full-time job."
"Why?"
"Because of me. The social services won't let her keep me unless she has a full-time job. Mind you, the pay is rubbish. She could probably make just as much money drawing portraits at birthday parties, but the social services won't hear of it."
Just then Aunt Michelle came out of the shop.
"Hello, Hoggie," she said. "Hello, Scooter. How was your day?" "It was fine," Hoggie replied. "How was yours?"
Michelle Claus smiled in reply, but Scooter noticed that the corners of her smile were pointing down rather than up.
"Join us for dinner, Scooter."
But Scooter had to go home. He caught a bus at a nearby bus stop, and Hoggie, Aunt Michelle, and the dogs started back to St. Clair's Lane.
"How was school today, Hoggie?"
Aunt Michelle asked, as they were walking through the labyrinth of poorly lit streets.
"It was all right,"
Hoggie replied evasively. Things at school were far from being all right, but Hoggie did not want to upset her aunt. She figured her aunt had enough things to worry about.
"And how was the library?" "Jimmy gave us a new book. It's really good." "Did you do anything else?"
For a moment, Hoggie was tempted to tell Aunt Michelle about hers and Scooter's encounter with Dr. Barnaby, but then she changed her mind. In her experience, grown-ups had a tendency to worry about things that weren't worth worrying about. She suspected that if she were to tell them about the whimsical Oxford scholar who had hired her and Scooter to help him find a lost book, she would be bombarded with questions. Who is this Dr. Barnaby? What kind of doctor is he? Why did he want to hire you? And so she replied only,
"Nothing else."
By then, Hoggie and Aunt Michelle had reached St. Clair's Lane. The street's single lamp-post cast just enough light to illuminate the steep stone stairs that led inside their house, a crooked old tree beneath its windows, and a solitary human figure at the foot of the stairs. The figure was small and bent, and it was issuing clouds of cigarette smoke. Just then, Higgledy and Piggledy halted suddenly, and pricked up their ears. Then, just as suddenly, they dashed towards the figure outside the house, ripping the leash out of Hoggie's hand.
"Hey, you two!"
Hoggie cried.
"Stop!"
She and Aunt Michelle ran after the pugs. Hoggie was not worried about the dogs attacking the person. They were not mean, but she did not want them to startle anyone, or soil their coats with their muddy paws. But to her surprise, Higgledy and Piggledy completely ignored the person. A moment later, they were prancing at the foot of the tree, their excited barks almost inaudible amidst the horrible, gut-wrenching roar of some invisible creature.
"Oh, bother!"
the solitary figure at the foot of the stairs uttered just then, and Hoggie recognized the voice as that of Mrs. Gullitch, their upstairs neighbour.
"Stupid cat!"
Mrs. Gullitch said grumpily, looking at the top of the tree where, perched on the uppermost branch, indignant and terrified, her cat, Bassoon, was meowing.
"I'm so sorry, Mrs. Gullitch,"
Hoggie said, grabbing Higgledy and Piggledy, and dragging them away from the tree.
"I don't know what came over them."
"They are dogs,"
Mrs. Gullitch said, just as gruffly, but without anger.
"That's what dogs do. Still, how am I going to get that animal out of the tree?"
Bassoon was balancing on the end of the branch, too afraid to try crawling back.
"We could shake the tree,"
Hoggie suggested.
"Oh, no,"
Aunt Michelle protested.
"He's too high up. Maybe we can coax him down with some milk."
But Bassoon was too frightened to care about food. As the hopelessness of his situation was now becoming clear, even to the cat himself, he let out a sad cry that sounded just like the musical instrument after which he was named.
"I could try climbing up there,"
Hoggie said, unbuttoning her coat.
"No,"
Aunt Michelle forbade her.
"it's too dangerous." "But how else are we going to get him?"
The three of them once again tilted their heads and looked at the terrified animal above.
"Can I help?"
they heard just then. Hoggie turned around. Standing beside her on the sidewalk was a young man. He must have been passing by, but for all the barking and meowing and arguing, no one had heard his footsteps. The young man was short, broad-shouldered, and quite good-looking. At the sight of him, Aunt Michelle went suddenly mute. All she could do was to point at Bassoon.
"The cat got away,"
Hoggie explained.
"Won't come down."
"I see."
The young man took off his coat, handed it to Hoggie, and turned to Aunt Michelle again.
"May I borrow your purse?"
he asked. Her fingers suddenly all thumbs, Aunt Michelle emptied her purse and gave it to the man. The man hung the purse around his broad chest, and then, quickly and gracefully, as if he did it every day at least 10 times a day, climbed up the tree.
"Please, be careful!"
Aunt Michel squeaked, as the young man reached the top of the tree, and began to inch his way along the branch, on the edge of which Bassoon was bouncing, looking more and more miserable with each passing moment. "Not to worry," the young man replied cheerfully. Just then he grabbed the cat by the scruff of the neck, stuck it into the purse, and began to crawl backwards. A few moments later he was back at the foot of the tree, handing the meowing Bassoon to Aunt Michel.
I don't know how to thank you,"
Aunt Michel said, taking the cat out of the purse and returning the animal to Mrs. Gullitch.
"Thank you, Michel,"
Mrs. Gullitch said, sticking the cat inside her coat to stop him running away again.
"And thank you. What is your name, dear?"
"Prospero," the young man introduced himself.
"Thank you, Prospero."
"Don't mention it," the man replied, putting on his coat.
"Well, I'd better be off before he does any more mischief,"
Mrs. Gullitch said, stuffing Bassoon deeper inside her coat, and slowly climbing up the stairs.
"Have a good night, everyone."
Everyone wished her good night.
You were amazing,"
Aunt Michel remarked then.
"Just like Spider-Man."
She giggled. Hoggy pursed her lips. She could climb trees too. She could have rescued Bassoon. "Are these yours?" Prospero bent and scratched Higgledy and Piggledy behind the ears.
"They are our neighbours,"
Michel Claus explained.
"My niece walks them."
"Is this your niece, then?" Prospero smiled at Hoggy. Hoggy did not smile back.
"Yes, her name is Hoggy,"
Aunt Michel confirmed.
"and I am Michel."
"You look familiar, Michel. Have we met before?"
"Maybe,"
Aunt Michel twittered eagerly.
"I work at the Camden Gallery. Have you ever been there?"
"I haven't," Prospero replied, "but I will." Aunt Michel giggled again, and Hoggy felt a sudden dislike of the good-looking young man. "You live in this house, Michel?" Aunt Michel opened her mouth, but before she had a chance to answer, Hoggy blurted out,
"She does. And I live here too, all the time."
She looked at the young man with defiance. Aunt Michel let out an embarrassed little cough. A rather awkward pause followed. "It's a nice house," Prospero said, breaking the silence at last. "A bit neglected, but nice."
"It is,"
Aunt Michel agreed readily. Hoggy snorted.
"Nice! Weren't you saying just this morning what a pathetic run-down hell-hole this place is, and that the landlord should be paying us instead of the other way round?"
Aunt Michel let out another embarrassed cough. Prospero studied Hoggy's sulky face for a moment or two. "Well," he said in the end, "I shouldn't keep you two outside any longer. It's getting cold. Have a good night." He took a few short steps down the street. "It was very nice to meet you, Michel. And you too, Hoggy."
"It was nice to meet you too, Prospero,"
Aunt Michel twittered. Hoggy didn't say anything. The young man waved at the two of them, and disappeared into the dark.
"I can't believe how rude you were to him,"
Aunt Michel said to Hoggy as they climbed up the stairs, and made their way through the building's dim corridors.
"And after he was so nice to us." "I don't like him,"
Hoggy announced.
"Why? He seems nice." "I still don't like him,"
Hoggy said stubbornly.
"What kind of a name is Prospero, anyway? It sounds like a character from a romance novel."
"He does," Aunt Michel said dreamily. Hoggy frowned.
"I'm serious. He sounds like a total fake. And all those questions he was asking you. Where you live, where you work. And you told him. Why did you do that?" "And what's wrong with that?" Aunt Michel said defensively. "People meet. People learn about each other. That's the whole point of meeting people, isn't it? You only just met. And already he knows everything about you. And what do you know about him?" Aunt Michel stumbled. "I know that he's well-mannered and helpful." "Oh, that's plenty," Hoggy said acidly. "You two are practically ready to get married." "You are being very rude," Aunt Michelle pronounced, opening the flat just then, and letting Hoggy and the dogs in. "Very rude, and very mean. Dinner will be ready in 15 minutes." Hoggy spent the rest of the evening sulking. Deep inside, she knew she was being silly, but she just could not help feeling annoyed with both Aunt Michelle and her new friend. Well, with him more than her. And the strangest thing was, she could not for the life of her explain why she felt the way she did.